Have you ever known a silence so complete that it has a sound of its own? A high ringing emptiness that fills your ears and presses in on you from all sides, reminding you that in the grand, brutal theater of the American West you are utterly and profoundly alone. It's a loneliness that's more than a feeling. It's a physical presence, a constant companion that sits with you at dawn and lies beside you in the dark. Silas Blackwood knew that companion better than any man he'd ever met. He had actively sought it out, trading the cacophony of the world, the gunshots, the shouting, the hollow promises of civilization for this deafening quiet. His ranch wasn't much, just 100 acres of stubborn dirt and thirsty rock clinging to life in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. His cabin was a simple, sturdy box of hewn pine, a fortress against the elements and, more importantly, against his own memories. He'd once been a man who wore a star on his chest, a Texas Ranger whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and respect. He had lived a life measured in spent cartridges and manhunts that stretched for weeks under a merciless sun. He'd seen the ugly truth of what men were capable of, the greed, the cruelty, the casual violence that flourished on the frontier like sagebrush. And one day, he'd had enough. He'd unpinned the star, hung up his gun belt, and rode west until the ghosts of his past were just faint whispers on the wind. He had come here to this valley to die, not in a blaze of glory, but slowly, peacefully worn down by the sun and the seasons, until he was just another part of the dust. But the West? The West has a long memory and a cruel sense of irony. It doesn't care what you want. And on a day when the heat shimmered off the ground in waves distorting the world into a fever dream, the West decided it wasn't finished with Silas Blackwood. It was about to send him a storm that would make all the gunfights of his past feel like a summer shower. His journey back from the outpost of redemption was a familiar ritual of survival. The town was little more than a collection of dusty storefronts and desperate souls, but it had flour, salt, coffee, and, if you knew where to look, ammunition. He'd traded a few well-tanned hides, his coin pouch now significantly lighter, his saddlebags heavy with the necessities of his solitary existence. He rode his mare Bess with the easy, comfortable rhythm of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. The trail snaked through a landscape of giants towering saguaros that stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels and ancient rock formations carved by millennia of wind and water. It was in a narrow pass where the red rock walls amplified every sound that he heard it. It wasn't the cry of a red-tailed hawk or the rustle of a lizard in the underbrush. It was the sound he hated most in the world, the sound of men laughing at another's pain. It was a ragged, cruel sound soaked in cheap whiskey and malice. The old instincts, the ones he'd tried to bury under years of solitude, surged to the surface with the speed and chill of a snake strike. The ranger in him was not dead, merely sleeping. He slid from the saddle, his movements economical and silent. He tethered Bess to a skeletal ironwood tree, whispering a soft word to her, his hand resting on the smooth, worn leather of the rifle scabbard. He moved forward on foot, his worn boots making no sound on the packed earth, his body hugging the shadows of the canyon wall. The scene that greeted him was a vision of casual depravity, illuminated by the flickering light of a poorly built campfire. 5 men trappers by the look of their greasy buckskins and the assortment of pelts piled nearby were arrayed in a loose circle. They were the scavengers of the frontier men who lived by their knives in their lack of conscience, their faces hard and stupid with drink. And in the center of their circle, the object of their vile amusement was a woman. To call her a Comanche woman was to state a fact as basic as calling the sun hot. It did nothing to describe the reality of her. She was a giant, a being of breathtaking scale and power. Even kneeling in the dust, her hands bound cruelly behind her back with wet rawhide that had already rubbed her wrists raw, she possessed an incredible presence. Her shoulders were wider than his cabin door, and her arms corded with the kind of dense muscle born from a life of constant brutal effort were thicker than his legs. Had she been standing, Silas guessed she would tower over him by a full head, a titan of a woman who would make even the biggest barroom brawlers think twice. Her face was a masterpiece of defiance, all high cheekbones and a jawline that seemed carved from the surrounding rock. It was bruised and swollen, a trickle of dried blood tracing a path from her hairline to her chin, but her eyes were where the real story was. They were black, bottomless pools of incandescent rage, a firestorm of hatred so pure it seemed to suck the very warmth from the campfire. They burned with a promise of retribution that was absolute. One of the trappers, a hulking, pig-eyed man with a matted beard, kicked a spray of dirt into her face. "Looky here, boys," he slurred a broken-toothed grin, splitting his face. "Got us a live one. Big as a damn barn, ain't she? Found her alone, wandering by the creek? Must be the last of her kind. The rest of 'em probably had the good sense to die off." The leader of the group, a wiry, weasel-faced man, Silas, recognized from a faded, wanted poster as Jedediah Kane, stepped forward. Kane was dangerous, not because he was strong, but because he was clever and completely devoid of empathy. He held a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a long, gleaming skinning knife in the other. "What's the plan, Jed?" another trapper asked, his eyes nervously flicking between Kane's knife and the woman's furious eyes. Kane took a long, gurgling pull from the bottle. "Ain't no plan," he rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of a filthy hand. "She's too much trouble. Can't sell her, can't transport her. Fought like a cornered she-bear when we took her. Broke Billy's nose." He gestured with the knife. "But the territory pays. $5 for a Comanche scalp. Seems like easy money to me." The woman didn't react. She didn't beg or cry out. She simply stared at Kane, her gaze a physical weight, challenging him to commit his final cowardly act. She was ready to meet her gods, and her only regret seemed to be that she couldn't take these filth eaters with her. And in that frozen moment, the carefully constructed dam that Silas had built around his soul shattered into 1,000 pieces. The quiet rancher was gone. The ranger was back. He couldn't stand by and watch this. This wasn't war. This was vermin torturing something magnificent for sport. He moved from the shadows into the firelight, a silent apparition. His hands were raised, palms open, a universal sign of peace that was completely at odds with the cold fury in his eyes. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice, a low, calm baritone that cut through their drunken chatter. The 5 men spun around, grabbing for pistols and rifles with clumsy, alcohol-fueled haste. Kane's weasel eyes narrowed. "Who in the hell are you? This is private business. Ride on old man before you get yourself hurt." Silas ignored the threats, his focus entirely on Kane. "Looks to me like you're about to conclude some business," he said, his gaze deliberately shifting to the kneeling woman. "I might be interested in making a counteroffer." A ripple of confusion, then brutish amusement passed through the trappers. The pig-eyed man let out a loud, braying laugh. "A counteroffer. For this one, you want to buy her, you crazy. She'll rip your throat out with her teeth the first chance she gets." Silas's eyes never left Kane. "Everything has a price." "What's yours?" Kane's cruel smirk returned. He was enjoying this, the sheer absurdity of the situation. He took another long drink, savoring the moment. He looked down at the woman with theatrical contempt, then back at Silas. "You really want to buy this, savage queen?" he sneered. "All right. I'm a man of commerce." He paused, letting the tension build, then spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near the woman's feet. $1. The other men exploded with laughter. It was the ultimate insult. A price that declared her life was worth less than the powder in a single cartridge, less than the whiskey in Kane's bottle. It was a joke, and they all expected Silas to get it to maybe laugh along or ride away in disgust. They didn't expect him to reach into the worn leather pouch at his belt. Silas's expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. With deliberate slowness, he untied the leather thong and tipped a single, heavy silver dollar into his calloused palm. It was an old Morgan, its surface worn smooth by the hands of 1,000 strangers, its silver tarnished by time and toil. He held it out, offering it to Kane. The raucous laughter choked and died in the trappers' throats. The only sound was the crackle and spit of the fire. Kane stared at the coin as if it were a coiled snake, his drunken amusement evaporating, replaced by a wary, confused anger. This quiet stranger wasn't playing the game. He was rewriting the rules with a single piece of silver. Silas stood his ground, his arm extended, the dollar glinting in the firelight. It was more than a coin. It was a statement, a gauntlet thrown down in the middle of nowhere. He was buying a life challenging their entire worldview, and he was doing it with their own currency of contempt. The quiet he had sought for so long was gone, replaced by the thundering of his own heart. He had no plan, no idea what would come next. All he knew was that the fire in that magnificent woman's eyes was not going to be extinguished tonight. Not while he still drew breath. Doing the right thing is rarely the easy thing. Sometimes it costs you everything. For Silas, it cost him $1 and the quiet life he had so desperately craved. But what he was about to receive in return would change him and the very fabric of the West forever. If you want to see where this incredible journey leads, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You are not going to want to miss a single second of this story, because the real fire is just about to be lit. Jedediah Kane stared at the silver dollar in Silas's outstretched hand, his beady eyes flickering between the coin and Silas's impassive face. For a moment it seemed his pride would win out, that he would lash out in a fury of wounded ego. But the glint of silver, no matter how small the amount was, a siren song that men like Cain could never resist. With a sudden snatching motion, he plucked the coin from Silas's palm, his grimy fingers closing around it. "She's all yours, cowboy," he sneered the insult, losing some of its bite now that he had been paid. "But there ain't no refunds if the merchandise is broke." He gestured dismissively to one of his men, a lanky youth with vacant eyes who shuffled forward and began sawing at the woman's rawhide bonds with his knife. The woman didn't move at first, even as the bonds fell away. She stayed on her knees, slowly, deliberately rubbing her wrists, bringing feeling back into her numbed hands. Her dark, unblinking eyes were fixed on Silas, not with gratitude, but with a profound, penetrating suspicion. She was a warrior, a survivor. In her world, nothing was free. Kindness from a white man was a currency she had never encountered, and she was searching for the hidden price, the inevitable betrayal that must surely follow. She was assessing him, weighing his intent, trying to understand what kind of predator he was. Was he just a different kind of monster than the ones who had just held her captive? Silas offered a curt, dismissive nod to Cain. "Pleasure," he said the word, tasting like bile. He then turned his back on the trappers, a calculated and deeply insulting gesture that also served to place his body between them and the woman. It was a move straight from his Ranger playbook. Establish a new line, dare them to cross it. He crouched down not too close, respecting her space. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, stripped of any command or condescension. "My name is Silas. Can you stand?" She looked at him, then at his offered hand, but she didn't take it. Her pride was a fortress. Using the ground for leverage, she began to rise. It was like watching a mountain being born. She unfolded herself from the dirt, her body uncoiling with a power that was terrifying even in its weakened state. Up and up she went until she eclipsed the fire, casting Silas and the entire camp in her enormous shadow. The trappers who had been snickering fell silent. Seen at her full height, their mockery was exposed for the foolish posturing it was. She was magnificent and terrible, a force of nature. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she swayed her hand instinctively, going to a deep, crudely bandaged gash on her thigh. It was then that Silas moved, not reaching for her, but simply standing close enough that she could lean on his shoulder if she chose. After a moment's hesitation, she did her weight immense and solid against him. Her touch was not one of dependence, but of temporary, pragmatic necessity. He guided her toward Bess, his patient mare, who looked at the giant woman with wide, nervous eyes. The process of getting her into the saddle was slow and agonizing every movement, sending a fresh wave of pain through her body. Yet she made no sound, her face a mask of stoic endurance. Silas swung up behind her, his arms encircling her to hold the reins, creating a fragile and forced intimacy. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, the tension in her powerful back, the shallow, ragged rhythm of her breathing. He nudged Bess forward away from the fire, away from the hate-filled eyes of Jedediah Kane. He didn't look back, but he could feel their gazes on him, a physical weight of malice and promised retribution. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was not over. For a man like Kane, $1 wasn't an insult. It was the story he would tell. But being outmaneuvered, being made to look like a fool by a quiet stranger, that was a debt that could only be paid in blood. The ride to his cabin was a journey through a landscape of shadows and silence. The moon was a pale sliver in a sky littered with 1,000,000,000 stars offering little light. Silas navigated by instinct and memory, his senses on high alert. He was acutely aware of the woman in front of him, of her pain, of her distrust. He didn't speak knowing that words would be an intrusion. He simply offered the silent, steady presence of a man taking her away from one hell, even if it was towards a future that was just as uncertain. His cabin, when they finally reached it, looked smaller than ever, a tiny island of man-made order in an ocean of primordial chaos. It was nestled in a small, defensible valley, a creek providing a steady supply of water, and a natural barrier on one side. He slid from the saddle, and then with great care helped her down. She leaned heavily against him, her strength finally beginning to fail. Inside, the single room was illuminated by the golden flickering light of a kerosene lantern. It was a sparse, functional space, a stone hearth, a sturdy table with one chair, a cot against the far wall and shelves holding the simple tools of a solitary life. He led her to the chair, the only one he owned, and she collapsed into it, a long, shuddering sigh escaping her lips. It was the first sign of weakness she had shown. "That leg needs to be looked at," Silas said gently. He didn't wait for permission, but moved with a quiet purpose that was reassuring in its competence. He fetched a basin and filled it with cool, clean water from the creek. He tore strips from a clean flour sack, his movements precise. He retrieved a small wooden box, its contents, a collection of tinctures, salves, and surgical tools from his ranger days. He knelt before her, placing himself in a position of supplication, an act that was not lost on her. Her eyes, wary and sharp, followed his every move. He carefully unwrapped the filthy, blood-soaked rag from her thigh. The wound beneath was far worse than he'd feared. It was a deep, ragged slice, already inflamed, and showing the telltale red streaks of infection. It was poisoned. Left untreated, the fever would take her, or the gangrene would claim her leg and then her life. "This will be painful," he stated, simply an apology and a warning in one. He began to clean the wound, his touch firm but surprisingly gentle. He worked with the detached focus of a man who had done this many times before, on himself and on others, in ditches and on battlefields. She hissed a sharp intake of breath, her entire body going rigid. Her hand clenched the arm of the chair, the wood groaning under the pressure, but she did not cry out, she did not pull away. She watched his face, her gaze, a searing intensity, as if she could divine his character by the way he performed this painful task. When the wound was as clean as he could make it, he reached for a flask of whiskey. For the pain he offered, holding it out to her, she looked at the flask, then at him, and gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken to him, her voice a low, husky rasp, rough with disuse and dehydration. It was a voice that held the deep resonance of thunder. Silas gave a small nod of understanding. It wasn't about the alcohol. It was about control. She would not dull her senses. She would meet this pain head on, just as she had met everything else. So he did the next best thing. Taking a deep breath, he unstoppered the flask and poured the raw, burning liquid directly into the open wound. Her body arched in a silent, violent spasm. A strangled gasp was torn from her throat, and her knuckles went white on the chair, but her eyes remained locked on his. She was testing him, and he was testing her. It was a brutal, shared crucible. In that moment of shared agony, a thread of profound respect was woven between them. He then took out a curved needle and a strand of gut. "Hold still," he murmured. and began to stitch the torn flesh together, his movements swift and sure. When he was done, he applied a thick, pungent salve of his own, making a mixture of comfrey and yarrow, and bound the leg in clean bandages. He stood up slowly, his own back aching with tension. He filled a tin cup with water from the basin and offered it to her. This time she took it. Her hand, which could have crushed his skull, was remarkably steady. She drank her throat, working the simple act of quenching her thirst, a return to the world of the living. She lowered the cup. "Thank you," she said, the two words, a monumental offering. "Silas," he said, reintroducing himself. He pulled a small crate over and sat near the fire, giving her space, letting the warmth of the hearth do its work. "Tave," she replied, her voice a little stronger. "It means the sun, in the language of my people." Silas looked at her at the fierce, indomitable light that burned in her eyes even now, and he thought that no one had ever been more aptly named. The silence that fell between them now was different. It wasn't empty or suspicious. It was a quiet space for healing, for assessment. But the reality of his situation began to settle in on him like a shroud. He had a wounded Comanche giantess in his home. He had a psychopathic trapper who now had a reason to hunt him. And he knew with the certainty of a man who understood the plains that Tave's people would be looking for her. And when they found her here with him, they would not stop to ask for the story. He had ridden out that morning, a lonely man seeking only to be left alone. He rode back, a man caught between three different converging wars, with only his wits, his gun, and the life of the incredible woman he had just saved to show for it. His peaceful death had just been indefinitely postponed. The days that followed were a delicate, unspoken negotiation, a slow and cautious mapping of the territory between two worlds that had convened in the 10 by 12-foot space of his cabin. Tave's recovery was a testament to her incredible constitution. Any other person, man or woman, would have been laid low for weeks by such a wound and the subsequent infection, but she seemed to draw strength from the very air, her body knitting itself back together with a fierce, stubborn will. The fever, when it came, was a violent, consuming blaze. It struck on the second night, and for 48 hours she was lost to him, trapped in the labyrinth of her own mind. Silas became a tireless nurse, a role he hadn't played since his own mother had passed from lung fever years ago. He kept the fire low, bathed her sweat-slicked brow with cool cloth soaked in creek water, and forced spoonfuls of a bitter tea brewed from willow bark, a frontier remedy for fever between her cracked and bleeding lips. In her delirium, the fortress of her stoicism crumbled, and he was granted fleeting, fragmented glimpses into the soul of the warrior. She spoke in the fluid, guttural cadences of her native tongue, the words tumbling out in a torrent of anguish and rage. He couldn't grasp the meaning, but he understood the emotion. He heard names spoken with love and others with venom. He heard what sounded like the sharp commands of a battle, the soft murmuring of a lullaby, and the keening cries of profound grief. He was an unwilling eavesdropper on the story of her life, a story written in a language of pain he was only just beginning to comprehend. During those long lamplit vigils, as he sat watching the rise and fall of her powerful chest, he allowed himself to truly study her. She was quite simply a masterpiece of human engineering. The intricate swirling tattoos that adorned her arms and shoulders were not mere decoration. They were a narrative patterns of successful hunts, spiritual visions, and victories in battle, each line a mark of honor. Even in the limp repose of fever, her hands were formidable, her long fingers and broad palms built for gripping a lance or drawing a heavy bow. He recalled the half-believed, half-mocked stories that circulated among rangers and soldiers, tales of the Comanche Paraboo, the warrior women said to be as fierce as any brave who rode into battle alongside their husbands and brothers. They were treated as campfire myths, boogeyman stories to frighten green recruits. But the myth was real, breathing raggedly on a makeshift bed of furs in his cabin, and the reality of her was more awe-inspiring than any legend. On the third morning, the fever broke as suddenly as it had arrived. She awoke with a clarity in her eyes that was startling. The delirium was gone, replaced by her usual sharp, assessing intelligence. From that moment, their dynamics shifted. She was no longer a passive patient. She was an active observer, her gaze following him as he went about his daily chores, her mind clearly analyzing his every action. She watched the way he mended a saddle blanket with neat, efficient stitches, the way he calmed Bess with a low murmur and a gentle hand, the way he methodically cleaned and oiled his rifle. It was the detached, professional curiosity of one survivor studying the methods of another. A week after her arrival, the turning point came. Silas was outside, engaged in the ceaseless, back-breaking task of chopping firewood. He was working on a thick, gnarled log of alligator juniper, a wood so dense and stubborn it seemed to mock the very idea of an axe. He swung again and again, his arms aching sweat, stinging his eyes, the axe blade biting only shallowly into the wood. He was so focused on his task, he didn't hear her approach until her shadow fell over him. He turned, startled to see her standing in the doorway, leaning on a sturdy branch he had carved into a crutch for her. She had been watching him, her head tilted slightly, a critical look in her eyes. "You fight the wood," she said, her voice stronger, now clearer. "You use only your arms. All your strength is wasted." Before he could form a reply, she hobbled forward, her injured legs still stiff but bearing her weight. "Let me," she said. It was not a request, but a quiet command. He hesitated for a second, then handed her the heavy, long-handled axe. In her immense grasp, it looked like a hatchet. With a focus that was absolute, she planted her feet, her good leg taking most of the strain, her body aligning into a posture of perfect balance and potential energy. She took a deep breath, and then with a single explosive grunt that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her, she brought the axe down in a devastatingly beautiful arc. The blade struck the juniper with a sound like a rifle shot, and the stubborn log, which had resisted all of his efforts, split perfectly in two. She looked at the two clean halves, then back at him, handing him the axe. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "The power does not come from your arms," she said, her voice a low rumble. "It comes from the earth through your legs, up your back. You guide it. You do not create it." Then, without another word, she turned and made her way back to the cabin. That single act, that simple lesson changed everything. It was an offering of knowledge, a sign of respect. It was the first brick laid in a bridge between them. Their interactions, hesitant before now, gained a new dimension. A silent curriculum was established. He would point to his coffee pot and say the word. She would respond with the Comanche equivalent. He taught her the names of constellations from an old astronomy book. She taught him which wild berries were safe to eat and which would send a man into convulsions. The cabin, once a bastion of silence, was now filled with the soft murmur of two languages, two cultures cautiously exploring one another. But a dark cloud loomed on the horizon, a threat that grew with each passing day. The threat of Jedediah Kane. Silas was no fool. He knew men like Kane were cancers driven by a festering sense of grievance and a bottomless capacity for cruelty. The dollar had been an insult, but the true wound had been to Kane's pathetic pride. He wouldn't let that go. He would come back not for money, but for revenge. On the 8th day, Silas's fears were confirmed. While checking his snares down by the creek, he found them boot prints, 2 sets. Clumsy, heavy-footed men trying and failing to move like ghosts. They hadn't come close to the cabin, but they had been watching from the ridge. Kane's scouts. They were testing his defenses, learning his routines. He didn't mention the tracks to Tave. Her body was healing, but he could see the strain in her eyes. The weight of her flight, her capture, and her uncertain future was a heavy burden. He would not add to it, but she knew. Her senses, honed by a lifetime of survival in a world that wanted her dead, were 1,000 times sharper than his. She saw the new tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the ridgeline. The following morning, as he was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, she spoke. "They are watching," she said. It was a statement of fact, not a question. He didn't look up from his work, the rhythmic shing, shing, shing of steel on stone, a steady counterpoint to his racing heart. "I know. They will come at night," she continued, "or at dawn, like scavengers." "Let them," Silas replied, his voice a low growl. "This valley has choke points. They have one way in. They think they're the hunters, but they're walking into my trap. Tave looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that went beyond respect. It was recognition. "You were a warrior," she said. "A lawbringer. I can see it in your hands, in your eyes." He finally met her gaze, the ghost of the man he used to be stirring within him. "A long time ago," he said. "Now I'm just a rancher, trying to be left alone." Tave's lips curved into that same faint smile he'd seen before. "A wolf does not become a sheep just because it has grown tired of the hunt," she said her words, echoing an ancient truth. He now understood the brutal calculus of his situation. He was facing a two-front war. On one side, the simmering, predictable threat of Cain and his craven thugs. On the other, the far more complex and dangerous threat of Tave's own people who would come not with malice but with the righteous fury of a tribe seeking to reclaim one of their own. He was a man standing in the eye of a hurricane, and the winds were beginning to pick up. The arrival of the Comanche came not with the skulking stealth of Cain's scouts, but with the raw elemental force of a thunderstorm breaking over the plains. It was dawn, the sky, a fragile canvas of pale pink and gray, the air still and cool. Silas was already awake, as he always was, patrolling the perimeter of his small valley, with a rifle in the crook of his arm. It was a ritual born of his ranger days, a habit of vigilance he'd never been able to shake. It was his ears, not his eyes, that caught the first sign of their approach. It was a low, distant rumble, a sound that resonated deep in his chest, more felt than heard. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of dozens of unshod hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth, a sound that spoke of speed, power, and singular purpose. He froze his body, going instantly, still every sense screaming in alarm. He turned and saw Tave already standing in the cabin doorway, silhouetted against the dim light within. She had heard it too. Her face, now almost fully healed, was a mask of grim resolve. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, weary resignation. This was the moment she had been running from, the confrontation she had known was inevitable. They crested the northern ridge like a vision from a nightmare, their forms stark against the brightening sky. There were more than a dozen of them, a full war party, their long hair flowing behind them, their bodies streaked with the stark, intimidating patterns of war paint. They carried rifles across their laps and lances adorned with eagle feathers, symbols of their prowess and spiritual power. They moved not as a disorganized mob, but with the fluid, terrifying coordination of a single organism, a wolf pack flowing down the hillside, intent on its prey. They didn't charge mindlessly. Their approach was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They fanned out, forming a wide, loose semicircle that effectively cut off any possibility of escape, their ponies dancing and snorting in the cool morning air. The circle tightened with a slow, deliberate pressure, each warrior a point of deadly intent, their dark eyes fixed on the small cabin and the two figures standing before it. A leader emerged from the group, a man whose physical presence was second only to Tave's. He was immensely broad and powerful, his face a landscape of arrogant pride, a long scar tracing a white line from his temple to his jaw. He rode his powerful war pony, with an innate, almost contemptuous ease guiding it forward, until he was a mere 20 yards from where Silas stood his ground, his hand now resting on the worn grip of his Colt. Stonehoof Tave breathed from behind Silas. The name was a low, guttural sound laced with a potent mixture of anger and disgust that told Silas this was not a stranger. This was the heart of her problem. The warrior, Stonehoof, completely ignored Silas, his burning gaze fixed solely on Tave. He spoke in the Comanche tongue, his voice a powerful, accusing roar that echoed off the canyon walls. "You are with him. You shame the blood of your ancestors by taking shelter in the lodge of a white skin. You run from your duty only to lie with a dog." Tave did not flinch. Instead, she stepped out from behind Silas, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. It was a small movement, but its meaning was immense. It was a public declaration of allegiance. She answered him in her own language, her voice ringing out with an authority that was every bit as powerful as his. "This man is not a dog. He is a man of honor who saved my life." I was taken by white trappers who meant to sell my scalp. He faced 5 men alone to save me while you were nowhere to be found." Stonehoof let out a harsh barking laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Saved you. We tracked those trappers. We heard their boasts in the town of redemption. They bragged of how they sold the Giant Comanche Woman for a single piece of silver. You were not saved. You were traded like a worn-out blanket. You have brought such dishonor upon the name of your father, the great chief Iron Quill, that it will be spoken of with shame for a generation." The accusation now laid bare was a poisoned dart. Silas didn't need a translation to understand the devastating impact of the words. He saw the flash of profound pain in Tave's eyes, the way her shoulders tightened. The story of his desperate act, twisted by the malicious tongues of Cain's men, had become the perfect weapon for Stonehoof to use against her. It validated his pursuit and painted her as a debased creature, with no honor left to defend. Finally, Stonehoof deigned to look at Silas, his eyes filled with a murderous contempt. He switched to a crude, heavily accented English. "White man, you have something that is not yours. She belongs to me. Give her to us now, and we will kill you quickly. It is more than you deserve." Silas kept his hand clear of his weapon, knowing that the slightest aggressive movement would be a death sentence. "She's not a thing to be owned," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "She is a guest in my home." She was wounded. When she is healed and wishes to leave, she is free to go. "She is not free," Stonehoof bellowed his horse, prancing nervously as it sensed its rider's escalating rage. "She is my betrothed. The marriage was decreed by our fathers to unite the Nokoni and the Yamparika clans. She ran from her sacred duty, and now she hides behind a white skin like a coward." The puzzle pieces slammed into place in Silas's mind, forming a picture that was both clearer and infinitely more deadly. This wasn't a rescue party. This wasn't even just about tribal law. This was the fury of a spurned suitor, a powerful man whose public honor and private pride had been shattered. And Tave, she hadn't just been wandering. She had been a fugitive, escaping an arranged marriage to this brutal, arrogant warrior. Her flight was a political act of rebellion, and he had unwittingly placed himself at the very center of the fallout. Tave's voice sharp as flint cut through the tense air. "I will not be wife to a man who mistakes cruelty for strength and arrogance for honor. I will not be the broodmare for a tyrant. I choose my own path." This ultimate act of defiance was the spark that lit the fuse. With a scream of pure rage, Stonehoof raised his heavy, steel-tipped lance, leveling it directly at Silas's heart. "Then you will die with him," he roared, gathering his reins to charge. But before he could spur his horse into motion, another warrior, older, with gray streaking his long braids and a calmer mien, rode swiftly to his side. He grabbed Stonehoof's arm and began speaking in a low, urgent tone, gesturing toward the sun, which was now climbing higher in the sky. It was a plea for caution, for adherence to some protocol. After a long, tense moment, Stonehoof reluctantly lowered his lance, his chest heaving, his face a mask of thwarted violence. He shot a look of pure hatred first at Tave, then at Silas. "Our chief, the great Iron Quill father to this faithless woman, is 2 days behind us. He will hear of this. He will see your dishonor with his own eyes. He will be the one to pass judgment." He turned his glare back to Silas. "We will make our camp at the mouth of this valley. If you try to run, we will hunt you down like the rabbits you are. There is nowhere you can hide." With that final threat, he wrenched his pony's head around, and with his warriors falling into formation behind him, galloped back to the valley entrance, establishing a grim, menacing perimeter. The immediate, explosive threat had been deferred, but it had been replaced by the cold, deliberate promise of a formal execution, one that would be sanctioned and overseen by the very man Tave had sought to honor, even in her defiance, her own father. With the departure of Stonehoof's war party to the mouth of the valley, the nature of the danger shifted. The threat was no longer a chaotic, unpredictable explosion of violence, but a cold, calculated siege. The warriors were a living wall, their distant campfires at night, a constant malevolent reminder of the cage that had been built around Silas's small patch of land. The cabin, which had been a haven for Tave and a sanctuary of solitude for Silas, now felt like a death row cell. The vast open sky that he had once cherished for its boundless freedom now seemed like the lid of a coffin, pressing down on them. There was nothing to do but wait for the arrival of the man who would be their judge, jury, and potential executioner, Chief Iron Quill. The silence that fell between Silas and Tave was no longer the comfortable quiet of two people learning each other's rhythms. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, thick with unspoken fears and the gravity of their shared predicament. The simple act of eating a meal of jerky and beans became a somber ritual, each bite a reminder of the precious, dwindling moments of life they had left. That evening, as the sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in fiery streaks of crimson and gold, Silas found he could no longer bear the silence. He had to understand the full scope of the trap they were in. He was sitting on the cabin's small porch, cleaning a rifle he had no real hope of using effectively against so many. The familiar scent of gun oil, a small, cold comfort. Tave was inside, but he could feel her presence, her restless energy contained within the small log walls. "He called you, his betrothed," Silas said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the still air. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the distant, flickering lights of the Comanche camp. He said, "You ran from your duty." What duty? Tave emerged from the cabin and came to stand near him, leaning against one of the porch posts. She was a magnificent, tragic figure in the fading light, a queen surveying her besieged and tiny kingdom. For a long while, she just watched the sunset, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, mournful river of sound carrying the weight of a life of difficult choices. "In the world of my people, Silas, a woman is many things," she began. "She is a daughter, a sister, a mother. She is the heart of the family, the keeper of traditions. But a daughter of a chief, she is also a political tool. A piece to be moved on a board to ensure the survival of her people." She took a deep breath. "For 2 generations, my people, the Nokoni, have had a simmering feud with the Yamparika clan. A dispute over hunting grounds, old insults, raids, and counter-raids. It has weakened us, both made us vulnerable to our true enemies, the Apache and the endless tide of white settlers. Our leaders, my father among them, decided the only way to end the bloodshed was to unite our clans through a powerful marriage." Her gaze hardened. "Stone Hoof is the son of the Yamparika chief. He is their greatest warrior, his name sung in their battle songs. He is feared, and he is respected for his strength. Our fathers met in council and decreed that I would become his wife. Our union would be a living treaty. Our children would have the blood of both clans. A new generation to lead a united, stronger people." She fell silent, the brutal logic of tribal politics hanging in the air between them. It was a story as old as time, a princess sacrificed for the good of the kingdom. "But you refused," Silas prompted gently. A bitter, mirthless smile touched her lips. "I did. I saw the logic. I understood the need for peace. But I have watched Stonehoof my whole life. I have seen him at the sun dance. I have seen him in council. A man's true nature is not in his war cries, but in his quiet moments. I have seen him strike a horse for stumbling. I have seen the fear in the eyes of the captives his war parties bring back. I have heard the whispers from his father's camp of his first wife, a gentle Yamparika girl who fell from a cliff one winter. He is a man with a hole in his spirit where his compassion should be. He does not build, he breaks. He does not lead, he dominates." Her voice dropped to a fierce whisper. "My father, he is a great man, a wise leader. But he sees Stonehoof as a necessary weapon to be aimed at our enemies. He does not see the poison at the heart of the man. I went to my father, I pleaded with him. I told him I would fight in the war parties, I would hunt for the tribe, I would do anything else to prove my loyalty. But I would not share my life with a monster. I would not bring children into the world to be raised by a man with a cruel heart." She turned to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He would not listen. To him, it was a daughter's fear against the survival of the people. The choice was clear. He told me the wedding would be at the next full moon. So 2 nights later, I took my best pony, a bow, and a knife, and I slipped away into the darkness. I was not running from my duty, Silas. I was running to save my own soul. Her story, told with such raw, painful honesty, resonated deep within him. It was the story of a person of principle trapped by a system that had no room for individual conscience. He found himself, to his own surprise, sharing a piece of his own locked-away past. "I was a ranger," he started, his voice rough. "I wore the star. I believed in the law. I believed it was a clean line between right and wrong. But the longer I wore it, the more blurred that line became. I saw the law used to protect the rich and punish the poor. I saw justice sold to the highest bidder." He paused, a specific memory rising unbidden. There was a family, the Millers. Good people. Had a small farm. A big cattle baron, a man named Prescott, wanted their land for the water rights. He couldn't buy them out, so he had his men rustle a few of his own cattle and plant the hides on the Millers' property. He called in the Rangers. My captain, a man who was on Prescott's payroll, sent me to make the arrest. He stared out into the darkness, but he wasn't seeing the valley. He was seeing a small sod house, a woman crying, and a man, John Miller, with the terrified, defeated eyes of an innocent man in a hangman's noose. I knew it was a setup. I could smell it. But I had my orders. I was the law. I arrested him. He was tried, and with Prescott's money paying for the judge and the witnesses, he was found guilty. I stood there and watched them hang him for a crime he didn't commit. His voice was choked with a self-loathing that was still fresh after all these years. After that, the star on my chest felt like it was burning a hole through to my soul. I turned it in the next day and rode away. I came here to forget that I was once a man who followed orders even when he knew they were wrong. As their confessions filled the space between them, the cabin ceased to be a prison. It became a shared space of understanding, a tiny raft in a hostile sea. They were no longer just a white man and a Comanche woman. They were two fugitives, two outcasts who had both broken with the codes of their worlds because their personal honor demanded it. A powerful, unspoken bond was forged in that shared darkness, an attraction that was deeper than mere physical desire. It was the profound recognition of a kindred spirit. He saw in her not a savage giant, but a woman of immense moral courage. She saw in him not just a reclusive white man, but a man of deep wounded integrity. It was a dangerous and impossible connection, a flicker of warmth in the face of the coming dawn. "When your father comes," Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper, "will he listen to this story?" Tave's face fell, the brief connection shattered by the cold light of reality. "He will listen to the story Stonehoof tells him. The story of a daughter who was captured, bought for an insulting price, and shamed publicly. To my father, to my people, a public insult requires a public answer. Tradition will bind his hands. He is a chief before he is a father. He will grieve for me," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "But he will not hesitate to cleanse our family's honor with my blood and with yours." The final fragile ember of hope died. They were trapped, not by warriors, but by a code of honor, as unyielding and unforgiving as the land itself. The day of judgment arrived not with the thunder of hooves, but with the quiet, methodical approach of a single, unwanted complication. The sun was just beginning to spill its golden light over the eastern ridge, a beautiful, indifferent witness to the human drama about to unfold. Silas and Tave stood outside the cabin, a silent, two-person bastion against the coming storm. They had not slept. Instead, they had kept a shared vigil, the silence between them, no longer awkward but filled with the grim solidarity of soldiers before a final charge. And then a new figure appeared, not from the north where the chief was expected, but from the west, following the same dusty trail Silas himself used to travel to redemption. This was a lone rider, moving with a steady, unhurried pace that spoke of authority, not aggression. He wasn't Comanche. He was a white man, astride a sturdy but unremarkable bay horse, and the morning sun caught the unmistakable glint of a five-pointed star pinned to his dusty vest. The sight of it sent a jolt of cold electricity through Silas. A U.S. Marshal. Here. Now. It was the worst possible complication at the worst possible time. The Comanche warriors at the valley's mouth had seen him too. They stirred, their forms coalescing into a line of silent, hostile observers, but they made no move to intercept him. Even the most aggressive war party knew that killing a federal lawman was like kicking a hornet's nest the size of Texas. It would bring the full, unforgiving weight of the U.S. Army down upon them. So they watched, their hands resting on their rifles, their faces grim. The marshal, a tall, raw-boned man with a sun-cured face and eyes the color of faded denim, rode directly into the heart of the standoff. His gaze was a slow, sweeping inventory of the scene, taking in the ring of warriors, the isolated cabin, the giant Comanche woman, and the solitary white man who seemed to be at the center of it all. He missed nothing. He dismounted with the fluid economy of a man who lived his life in the saddle, his spurs making a soft, lonely jingle in the charged silence. Silas Blackwood, the marshal, said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that seemed to carry the dust of 1,000 miles. Figured I'd find you sitting in the middle of a hornet's nest. Some things never change. Silas felt a jolt of recognition. The man was Elias Vance. They had ridden on a posse together once years back, tracking a gang of outlaws through the Malpais. Vance was a hard man, unyielding and relentless in his pursuit of the law, but he was also known to be scrupulously fair, a rare quality in their line of work. Vance, Silas, acknowledged, his voice tight. "You're a long way from your usual territory. What kind of trouble are you chasing?" Vance's pale eyes flickered from Silas to the cabin door where Tave stood, half concealed in the shadows, her immense height still obvious. "The worst kind," he said, lowering his voice so only Silas could hear. "Got a report from a circuit preacher. The Miller family. Over on the San Pedro. The whole family. Slaughtered in their beds 2 nights ago. Man, wife, 4 kids. Scalped." The words hit Silas like a punch to the gut. The Millers. A quiet, God-fearing family of sodbusters trying to scratch a life from the unforgiving dirt. The news was a cold wave of nausea. The preacher was riding by, saw the door swinging open, the place too quiet. Vance continued, his voice, flat, devoid of emotion. He was the one who found them. Said he saw tracks. 12 or more horses unshod. Headed this way. His gaze was now hard as flint. "So I ride out here and what do I find? A Comanche war party laying siege to the cabin of a retired ranger. You want to start explaining, Silas. And you better make it good." Before Silas could even begin to process the horrific news and its terrifying implications, Stonehoof saw his opportunity. He spurred his horse forward, flanked by 2 of his most imposing warriors, his face arranged into a mask of solemn cooperative concern. He recognized the power of the badge, and he knew how to play this game. Marshal Stonehoof called out, his English surprisingly clear and articulate, a skill he had clearly kept hidden before. "We are here to see justice done, same as you. This man Blackwood has taken a woman of our tribe against our laws. She is a fugitive, and he is her accomplice." Vance turned his cool, assessing gaze on Stonehoof. "That may be your business, but it ain't mine. I'm investigating a massacre." Stonehoof's expression was a masterpiece of feigned gravity. "Perhaps our business is the same. We have been tracking this woman for many days. Our journey has not taken us near the Miller settlement. We are warriors, not butchers of children." He then pointed a long, dramatic finger towards the cabin directly at Tave. "But this woman, she has a shadow on her spirit. She defies her father. She runs from her people. She breaks our most sacred traditions. She consorts with a white man. Who can say what a person with no honor is capable of?" It was a brilliant, venomous, and utterly devastating move. In a single stroke, Stonehoof had masterfully woven his personal grievance into the fabric of the marshal's investigation. He had deflected all suspicion from his war party and painted Tave as a rogue element, an unhinged woman capable of any atrocity. He was feeding the marshal a narrative, that every white man on the frontier was conditioned to believe the story of the savage Indian. Silas saw the deadly trap spring shut around them. "That's a damn lie," Vance Silas snapped, stepping forward. "She's been right here with me for over a week. She was wounded near death when I found her. She couldn't have gone anywhere." Wounded, how Vance's eyes narrowed the question sharp as a knife point. She was the captive of some trappers. "I intervened." Silas said the words sounding weak and insufficient even to his own ears. "So you admit to harboring a Comanche, and you can personally vouch for her whereabouts every minute of every day for the past week." Vance pressed his voice, taking on the cold, official tone of an interrogation. This was the crux of it. The impossible choice. If Silas told the full truth that he'd been sheltering a native woman, a hostile in the eyes of the law, he would be arrested as an accomplice, a sympathizer, a traitor. His word would mean nothing. If he lied or hedged, Vance would see right through him, and he would be guilty of obstructing a federal investigation. He was caught in a crossfire, pinned down between the inflexible honor code of the Comanche and the unyielding letter of his own people's law. Seeing the impossible predicament Silas was in, Tave made her own move. She stepped out from the shadows of the cabin, emerging into the full, unforgiving light of the morning. She did not limp. She did not cower. She stood to her full, magnificent height, a colossus of proud defiance. Her gaze was not on Stonehoof, but directly on the marshal. The sheer force of her presence, her towering stature, and the unshakable confidence in her bearing made even the hardened, unflappable Elias Vance take an involuntary half-step back. "I am Tave, daughter of Iron Quill of the Nakoni people," she announced, her voice, a clear, deep contralto that commanded attention. "I did not harm your white family. My quarrel is with that man," she gestured contemptuously at Stonehoof, "not with innocent people. This man, Silas Blackwood, speaks the truth. He saved me. He is a man of honor." Marshal Vance was for a rare moment in his life rendered speechless. He had dealt with natives his entire career, broken men on reservations, captured warriors in chains, grieving women. He had never, ever encountered anyone like Tave. Her regal demeanor, her articulate English, her absolute lack of fear, it was completely at odds with the savage caricature Stonehoof was desperately trying to sell. Ma'am Vance finally managed his hand, instinctively going to the brim of his hat, in a gesture of ingrained reflexive respect he surely wasn't even aware of. That may be, but the law is the law. A terrible crime has been committed. I have to follow the evidence. And right now the only evidence I have is a Comanche war party camped 2 miles from a slaughter. The pressure in the valley had become unbearable. It was a 3-way standoff, a deadly triangle of law, tradition, and survival. Silas knew that the fragile peace was about to shatter. It would only take one nervous warrior, one misinterpreted gesture, one more accusation, and this valley would become a graveyard. And the one man who might have the wisdom to defuse it all, Chief Iron Quill, was still somewhere out on the vast, indifferent prairie. Just as the air in the valley grew so thick with tension, it felt hard to breathe, a new procession appeared on the northern ridge precisely where Stonehoof had predicted. But this was not a war party. There was no aggressive posturing, no painted faces thirsting for battle. This was a small, formal delegation of 5 riders moving with a slow, deliberate dignity that spoke of peace and high purpose. At their head rode a man who even at a distance radiated an aura of absolute authority. He was older, his long hair more silver than black, his face a noble, unreadable mask carved by decades of leadership and loss. He carried a single, ornate ceremonial lance, not as a weapon, but as a staff of office. There was no doubt who this was. This was the great Chief Iron Quill. Instantly, the entire dynamic of the valley shifted. Stonehoof and his warriors, who had been preening with aggressive confidence, straightened their postures, their faces becoming deferential, their belligerence evaporating like morning mist. Marshal Vance watched the approaching chief with the wary professional respect of one apex predator acknowledging another. He knew he was no longer dealing with a hot-headed young warrior. He was facing a political leader, a man who held the power of war and peace in his hands. Chief Ironquill dismounted with the fluid grace of a much younger man. His first act was a masterstroke of diplomacy. He completely ignored his daughters Stonehoof and Silas. Instead, he walked directly toward the U.S. Marshal, a clear and unmistakable signal that he recognized and respected the authority of the white man's law, even on what he considered his own land. Marshal Vance, the chief, said his English flawless, cultured, and completely without accent. It was the English of a man who had negotiated treaties not traded for trinkets. I am Ironquill, leader of the Giant Comanche. I understand there has been a great tragedy, and I see you have met my daughter Tave, and the man who would be my son-in-law Stonehoof. It seems my family has caused you a great deal of trouble. Vance, clearly taken aback by the chief's eloquence, an immediate grasp of the situation, gave a curt nod. Chief, it's more than trouble. A family has been murdered. Your warriors are the only hostiles reported in this territory. Ironquill's face grew grave, his dark eyes filled with a sincere and profound sadness. Marshal, I grieve for this family. But I tell you now, on the honor of my ancestors, this was not the work of my people. The Nokani do not make war on sleeping children. That is the act of dogs of coyotes who scavenge in the dark. It is not our way. His gaze swept over Stonehoof and his men, a silent but powerful rebuke. He then turned and for the first time he addressed his daughter. Tave, he said, his voice heavy with the disappointment of a father rather than the anger of a chief. You fled your duty. You defied the council. You have brought shame and suspicion upon our family name. Tave met her father's stern gaze, her own eyes, a mixture of filial love and unwavering principle. Father, she said, her voice clear and strong, I did not flee my duty to our people. I fled a union with a man who has no honor. I would not bring a cruel heart into your lodge and call it peace. Stonehoof, standing nearby, bristled his face, darkening with fury at the public insult. She lies, he spat, unable to contain himself. She shames you further with her falsehoods. She fled to the arms of this white man. He bought her. The trappers boasted of it. He paid a single coin for her as one would for a whore. The vile accusation now spoken aloud in front of her father, and a federal lawman hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Every eye in the valley martial warrior chief swung to fix on Silas Blackwood. This was it, the moment of reckoning. He was on trial, and his life, Tave's life, and the fragile peace of the entire region rested on the words he was about to speak. Chief Ironquill turned his full, undivided attention to Silas. His eyes were like black diamonds, sharp and penetrating, and Silas had the distinct feeling that this man was looking not at his face but directly into his soul, weighing every truth and every lie he had ever told. You are Silas Blackwood, the chief stated, his voice calm and measured. The stories of the Rangers called you Espiritu the Ghost, because one day you simply vanished. I have heard these stories. Now the time for stories is over. I will hear your truth. Speak it now, and speak it plainly. Silas felt the crushing weight of the moment. He knew instinctively that any attempt to spin a tale, to omit a detail to make himself look better, would be his undoing. A man like Ironquill would smell a lie like a wolf smells blood on the wind. The only path forward, the only weapon he had, was the plain, unvarnished, and utterly absurd truth. He took a deep breath, meeting the chief's intense gaze without flinching. Chief Ironquill, he began, his voice carrying in the dead silence of the valley. I came upon your daughter in the camp of 5 white trappers. Their leader was a man known as Jedediah Kane. At the mention of Kane's name, Silas saw a flicker of contempt in the chief's eyes. The name was known. They had her bound. They were drunk. And they were about to kill her and take her scalp for the $5 bounty. He paused, letting the ugly fact settle. I was one man. They were 5. I was not a ranger anymore. I had no badge, no authority to challenge them. A gunfight would have been suicide for both myself and for her. He looked over at Stone Hoof, his eyes cold. "Your facts are correct, but your heart is blind." They were mocking her, tormenting her. I knew I could not appeal to their honor because they have none. So I appealed to the only god they worship, greed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old tarnished Morgan silver dollar. He held it up in the palm of his hand, letting the morning sun glint off its worn surface. I offered to buy her. Cain, in his drunken cruelty, thought it was a fine joke. He named a price that he felt matched her worth in his eyes. He said $1. Silas's voice dropped, becoming low and intense, filled with the memory of the moment. I did not pay this dollar to own her. I paid it to throw his own filth back in his face. I paid it to show him and his men and God himself that a human soul cannot be given a price. I paid it as an act of profound contempt. It was not a purchase, Chief. It was an insult. It was the only weapon I had left to fight with. After they took the coin and left, I brought your daughter here. I tended her wounds. I gave her food and shelter. I have offered her nothing but my protection. That is the entire truth of it. A deep, ringing silence descended upon the valley. Every person present was motionless, captivated by the simple, raw power of his testimony. Marshal Vance stared at the silver dollar in Silas's hand, a new grudging respect dawning in his tired eyes. Stone Hoof was for once speechless, his face a mask of confusion, his carefully constructed narrative of shame and prostitution crumbling into dust. Tave gazed at Silas with an expression of such raw, undisguised gratitude and wonder that it made his heart ache. He had not just defended her. He had understood and articulated the honor in her lowest moment. And Chief Iron Quill, the great chief, stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable cipher. He looked from the coin in Silas's hand to the shamefaced fury of Stone Hoof, to the proud, tear-filled eyes of his daughter, and back to Silas. He was a statesman, a leader, a father, and a judge, and he was processing all the conflicting evidence, all the tangled threads of law, honor, and human decency. His expression gave nothing away. His judgment was coming, and Silas knew with a terrifying clarity that everything he had ever been and everything he ever would be was being weighed in the palm of this old man's hand. Chief Iron Quill remained silent for a long, deliberate moment, letting the weight of Silas's testimony settle over the assembled parties. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. He was not just considering the facts. He was reading the hearts of the men and women before him. When he finally spoke, he did not address Silas or his daughter. He turned first to the representative of the other world, the man with the badge. Marshal Vance, he began, his voice calm and resonant. The law you serve is a powerful thing. It is written in books and carried out by men with guns. But it is not the only law. There is also the law of cause and effect, the law of the human heart. You seek the men who murdered the Miller family. Let me ask you as one thinking man to another who had more to gain from such an act. He gestured towards Stone Hoof and his warriors. My people who seek to live in peace, however uneasily beside yours. Or this man Silas Blackwood speaks of Jedediah Cain, a man known to trade in death, a man who profits from scalps and the whiskey that fuels hatred. Is it not a strong possibility that such a man, knowing my warriors were in this territory, would commit such an unspeakable crime to set your world against mine, to start a fire so that he might profit from selling the water to put it out? The logic was impeccable, and it landed with force. It offered Marshal Vance something he desperately needed, a logical, credible alternative to a full-scale war with the Comanche. It was a path to justice that didn't involve a bloodbath. Vance's jaw tightened as he considered it. He knew the type. Men like Cain were vultures who thrived on chaos. It was more than plausible. It was likely. It's a strong lead, Chief Vance admitted, his tone shifting from prosecutorial to investigative. A damn strong lead. Having planted the seed of a new investigation, Iron Quill then turned his attention to the internal threat to the arrogant young warrior whose pride had nearly ignited the entire valley. Stone Hoof, the chief said, and his voice was now laced with the cold iron of command. You came here speaking of honor. You accused my daughter of bringing shame upon our people. You used the story of a single coin to paint her as unclean. But my ears hear a different story. His gaze was sharp as a lance tip. My ears hear the story of a man, a stranger who stood alone against 5 armed men, not with a gun, but with his wits. I hear of a man who understood that the greatest way to defeat a vile enemy is not to stoop to his level, but to make his own vile nature his undoing. He then did something extraordinary. He began to weave a new reality using the threads of tradition itself. In the ways of our ancestors, he announced his voice booming across the clearing, his words directed at his own warriors as much as at Stonehoof. When a warrior wishes to declare his intentions for a woman to show her family that he is a man of substance who will protect and provide for her, he offers a gift, a bride price. It is a symbol of his honorable intent. It is a sign of the highest respect. He turned and looked directly at Silas, and in his ancient eyes there was a gleam of brilliant political cunning. This man, Silas Blackwood, does not know our specific customs. He is a stranger to our ways, but his heart, it seems, is Comanche. He did not pay Jedediah Cain for my daughter's body. Through the worthless vessel of our shared enemy, he paid me her father a symbolic bride price. He declared to the world his intention to be her protector. He did not bring dishonor upon my house. He has bestowed upon it the highest honor a man can offer. The entire valley was struck dumb with the sheer audacity and genius of the declaration. Stonehoof's jaw hung open his face, a mask of pure, uncomprehending rage. He had been so completely, so thoroughly outmaneuvered, he couldn't even form a protest. The chief had taken his primary weapon, the story of the dollar, and reforged it into a shield for Tave and a sword of honor for Silas. To argue against it now would be to argue against the sacred traditions of the ancestors, an unthinkable act. Tave stared at her father, her eyes wide, with a stunned, dawning awe. She was witnessing not just a father protecting his child, but a master statesman reshaping reality itself with the power of his words and his wisdom. Marshal Vance, a pragmatist to his core, immediately saw the legal beauty of the chief's move. A bride price, he said, the words tasting strange in his mouth. A tribal matter of marriage custom. He looked at Silas, then back to the chief. That would place the entire affair between your daughter and Mr. Blackwood firmly outside of my jurisdiction. Iron Quill gave a slow, magnanimous nod as if this were the most natural conclusion in the world. He then delivered his final, masterful stroke, sealing Stonehoof's fate. My people desire justice for the Miller family as much as you do, Marshal. It is a stain on this land we share. My warriors are the greatest trackers on the plains. He looked directly at Stonehoof, his expression leaving no room for argument. Perhaps the great warrior Stonehoof, who is so concerned with honor, would like a chance to prove it. He will take his 2 best men and guide you. He will help you hunt Jedediah Cain to the ends of the earth. He will prove that the Comanche are allies of the white man's true law, not its enemies. He had boxed him in. It was a command disguised as an offer. To refuse would be to show cowardice, and to admit his earlier accusations were born of personal spite. To accept was to be forced to serve the very man he had sought to destroy, and to hunt down the men whose lies he had used as a weapon. His face purple with a rage he could not express. Stonehoof gave a stiff, jerky nod of assent. The crisis had been averted. The powder keg had been submerged in the waters of the chief's profound wisdom. With a few perfectly chosen words, Iron Quill had satisfied the law, silenced his political rival, saved his daughter's life, and elevated a lonely, disgraced ex-ranger to the status of an honorable suitor. As Silas watched the old chief, he finally understood what true power was. It wasn't the authority of a badge or the strength of a warrior's arm. It was the rare and profound ability to see the truth that lay hidden in a tangle of lies, and to have the courage and wisdom to weave that truth into a new and better world. With Stonehoof's reluctant departure, a palpable sense of peace, fragile though it was, descended upon the small valley. He and his two warriors, now under the grim, watchful eye of Marshal Vance, rode west, their quest for vengeance ironically transformed into a mission for a justice they had sought to pervert. Their absence was like the lifting of a great suffocating weight. Chief Iron Quill decreed that his delegation would remain camped at the valley's entrance for 2 more days. It was a strategic move, a public display of peaceful coexistence meant to quell any lingering suspicions from the nearby white settlements and to ensure Vance's investigation started on the right foot. But it was also a gift of time. The chief approached Silas, his stern public demeanor replaced by a warmth that was almost paternal. He extended his hand palm open in the Comanche gesture of peace and friendship. "Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice now quiet and personal. "My daughter has a keen eye for the spirits of men. She told me yours was strong and true. She was not mistaken. You have done my family a great service this day." Silas met the gesture, his hand clasping the chief's weathered one. "I only told the truth," Silas replied, feeling a humility he hadn't experienced in years. "It was your wisdom, Chief, that saved us. I have never seen a man wield words like you do." A rare, genuine smile touched Iron Quill's lips, crinkling the corners of his wise eyes. "Words are the arrows of a chief, my friend. They must be aimed with care. The words I spoke today were a shield built to defend against the poison of many enemies." He paused, his gaze shifting to his daughter Tave, who was now approaching them, her powerful form moving with a renewed and confident grace. "But shields once raised have a presence of their own. My declaration of a bride price was a necessary fiction to solve a problem of law and honor. But in the eyes of my people, and now in the eyes of the Marshal, it has created a new truth. Words have power, Silas Blackwood. They can build a bridge, or they can build a cage." Silas felt his heart begin to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat in his chest. He understood the chief's meaning perfectly. The political solution had created a deeply personal complication. He looked at Tave, who had stopped beside her father. The fierce warrior who had defied a war party now looked uncertain, her gaze holding a question she seemed afraid to ask. Father Tave said, her deep voice softer than Silas had ever heard it. "The shield you built was strong, but you are right. What is the truth that now lives behind it?" Iron Quill looked from his formidable daughter to the quiet, steadfast ex-ranger. He saw what neither of them had yet dared to admit to themselves, the deep magnetic pull between two solitary souls who had found an unlikely reflection in one another. He saw the respect that had blossomed into something more, something fragile and powerful and terrifying. That the chief said with a profound gentleness is no longer for me to decide. My words have opened a path where before there was only a cliff's edge. Whether the two of you choose to walk that path together is a truth that only your own hearts can speak. He placed a warm, heavy hand on Silas's shoulder. My people will remain for 2 sons. It will solidify the story. Give no room for gossip or doubt upon Stonehoof's return. During this time, my daughter will remain under your roof, as is proper for a suitor who has declared his intentions. After that, the future is a blank page. It is up to you to write upon it." With that, the wise chief gave them a final knowing look, turned, and walked back toward his own camp, leaving Silas and Tave alone in the vast, echoing silence of the valley. The world had been irrevocably altered. A few hours ago, they had been prisoners awaiting a death sentence. Now, they were bound by a public declaration that was simultaneously a clever lie and a possibility so real it made the air crackle. "My father is a master strategist," Tave said, her voice a low murmur as she watched him go. She turned to Silas. "But in solving one problem, he has created another. In the eyes of the world, you are now the man who has laid claim to the giant daughter of Iron Quill. It will make you a legend to some and a target to many." "I've been a target before," Silas said, his gaze fixed on her. In the warm afternoon light, her face was a landscape of strength and pride, but he could now see the subtle lines of vulnerability around her eyes and mouth. Tave, the chief, he called it A story. A necessary fiction. He took a hesitant step closer. But what if we don't want it to be? The question hung in the air between them, shimmering and immense. The 2 days that followed were a time out of time, a suspension of the rules of the world. They talked for hours, their conversations no longer constrained by the immediate threat of death. He told her stories of his childhood in the green hills of East Texas, a world away from this arid landscape. She described the smell of the buffalo herds on the move, a scent she feared her children would never know. He showed her the few treasured books on his shelf. She showed him how to make a poultice from yucca root that could draw the sting from a scorpion bite. They moved around each other in the small cabin, a clumsy but graceful dance of two people learning a new and intricate choreography. The loneliness that had been the bedrock of Silas's existence for years was gone, replaced by a presence so powerful and vital it seemed to fill every corner of his world. And he knew with a certainty that was both exhilarating and terrifying that he never wanted that loneliness to return. The chief had opened a path, but as the second sun began to set, Silas knew that he and Tave would have to find the courage to take the first step onto it themselves. On the final evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, the silence between Silas and Tave was no longer one of caution, but of profound, unspoken truth. They sat on the porch watching the sky burn, the world holding its breath with them. It was Tave who broke the sacred quiet, her voice a low murmur of her deepest fear. "My father's words were a shield, Silas," she began, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "But they have bound you to a giant. I was made for treaties and alliances, a symbol of strength to be bartered. I was not made for a quiet man's heart." In that confession, Silas heard not the voice of a warrior, but of a woman who had been convinced her entire life that she was a monument too large to be loved simply for herself. He knelt before her, taking her immense hand in both of his. The physical disparity between them was vast, yet the connection was absolute. "When I look at you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had long thought buried, "I don't see a giant. I see Tave. I see the fire that faced down 5 killers, and the wisdom that taught me about the earth. I see the heart that would rather break than bend to a man without honor." He looked directly into her soul. "You are not the woman a man like me chooses. You are the woman I never believed I was worthy enough to find." Her tears were not of sorrow, but of release, each one, a testament to a lifetime of being seen, but never truly understood until now. Her hand, which could crush stone, cupped his cheek with the softness of a prayer, and in that touch their future was sealed. Their wedding was not a grand affair, but a quiet merging of two worlds, blessed first by the sacred smoke of Chief Ironquill's pipe, and then by the humble words of a traveling preacher. But the true symbol was forged in the Comanche blacksmith's fire. The tarnished silver dollar, the price of a life, was melted down and reborn as two simple rings, transforming a symbol of contempt into a covenant of love. The ranch that was once a monument to solitude became a bridge, a place where two peoples could meet in peace. Silas Blackwood, who had paid $1 to defy a monster, found he had purchased his own salvation. He had sought peace in emptiness, but found it instead in the magnificent, all-consuming fire of the woman who now wore his ring and owned his heart.